How do you make smart decisions in a crisis? That's what today's Boostcast is all about, and I'm delighted to be joined by Andrea Lewis, who is Chief Nurse in an NHS Trust now in the south of England, and Colonel Simon Browne of the British Army. Both have to manage large numbers of people and make decisions which affect people's lives. I'm delighted that they can join us to help us as leaders to make smart decisions when the pressure is at its highest. We're very fortunate to have both Colonel Simon Browne and your good self, Andrea, on this call. The structure is three things. I'd love to cover these three things because I'm sure a lot of people don't know. What do you do in the military when you're not at war? And how do you make decisions as leaders in that sense? How do you preempt when you're not at war, some major project that you have to expect might happen, contingency planning? And then the last point is when there is a crisis or you are in a battle, how do you make decisions that are smart as leaders? So that's the structure of this Boostcast. And I'd like to start in that context. Simon, if I could come to you.
Yeah.
Active colonel in the British Army. And when you're not at war, what's the leadership role like? How do you make decisions?
It's interesting because the leadership role actually in peacetime, we often joke, is actually more difficult than it is when you're on operations because you have a much wider focus. But I think people wouldn't be surprised if I say that when we're not at war, we train and we train relentlessly. But there is a real sense of purpose to it. And to try and help people understand, you can kind of break it down into big handfuls. Obviously, we do physical training. You'd expect that. Being fit makes you robust. But I think it's also very underrated that being fit makes you mentally resilient as well. And actually, at a time like this, I think people shouldn't lose sight of that. Keep yourself fit, keeps yourself happy. It genuinely does. A lot of training, of course, is based on repetition, doing things repeatedly. So it's in the muscle memory. Believe me, there are things in my soul I will never be able to forget. And that's really important because you often hear when a soldier does something, they just say, well, my training kicked in. And that's what you're trying to achieve in peacetime, is to get to the point where you can just do things unconsciously. But what's really important about the training is what you're trying to do is give everybody a huge mental library of experience so that when they do get into a situation, something just kind of kicks in their brain that they kind of half recognize, or they recognize enough of the situation. And of course, we know that as intuition. I think people use intuition a lot, but it's not actually that well understood. And it is really the ability to just do something without really consciously thinking about it. And in our business, when it does get to the very adversarial end of it, the person who makes the decision quickest wins every time. So that's what you're trying to do in peacetime. And I guess you could bring that to, I'd bring that to life by saying, and I was talking to Andrew about this, is that, I went to Afghanistan as a company commander at the start of the campaign in 2002. And the training that prepared me for that actually happened in Canada. I was a commanding officer in Iraq in 2006 and 2010. And the training that prepared me for that happened in Poland. The training bore no resemblance at all to the situation that I went into. But what both those training events had in common is they had enormous complexity. They were very stressful. They really pushed us to our limit. And in fact, what they did is they just filled up my library with a few more volumes of experience. But also what was really key, and I think Andrea can allude to this as well, is that I did those exercises with the teams that I then went on operations. So by the end of it, we knew each other, we trusted each other, we understood each other's strengths and our weaknesses. So that's what we do. We train, but it's more than just, I say jump and you ask how high.
And Andrea, as chief nurse now of an NHS trust, what resonated in what Simon said for you?
So I think it resonates a lot, actually. And I think, again, from my previous army experience, and certainly the Afghan deployment, I mean, there's a lot to be said, I think, in the army, that you are very blessed in when you're in peacetime, as it were, or when you're not deployed, is to be able to train as whole teams, I suppose. And so for me, reflecting on before I went to Afghan, is that my teams were the hospital as a whole, and those sub-teams, as it were, were put through our paces in a place called Strensall in York, which is basically it was a mock replica of the hospital in Afghanistan, in a huge hangar. So as you walked into the hospital in Bastion, the way it had been set up was just the same. So having gone through the training there, so the environment you were familiar with, but actually then beginning to work with your teams in those specific departments. And as Simon alluded to, that repetition, really, really helped. And what they used to do is put the casualty serials through. So again, they were very lifelike. And these were casualties used who were amputees that, bless, had been, obviously in Afghanistan before, had since left the army, but were sort of giving something back, being actors for us in the casualty simulation. But golly, I mean, the makeup was amazing and was so real life that actually for the guys, when they did come in and they were faced with this casualty, that it was so lifelike that, that shock that they initially had was for real, actually. And then it was obviously seeing how the teams reacted to that and the actions on. And from that, as Simon alludes to, you can then start to pull out the strengths and the weaknesses from that, and then work on those that you need to and tweak them before you then deploy for proper. I suppose the difference here in the NHS is that you don't have the beauty of being able to take all of your teams collectively out of the hospital and do a wonderful bespoke training package. That just can never happen, because obviously the operational tempo that we're working at, it's just a constant thing. So all you can do is try and do it in sort of that subgroup team working, I suppose, which is what we did. And thankfully, when the sort of the COVID back in January and February, when it was sort of starting, the build up with COVID starting to happen, that's what we did do, is start to look at the sort of what training do we need to do, what upskilling do we need to do for the teams, where do we think individuals will be best placed within the hospitals, moving from one particular area to another to be able to strengthen particular teams. One area that I will mention is intensive care, for instance. I mean, that's been featured a lot, hasn't it, on the news, and when we first started going through this situation, there was a real concern about how many patients we would have in intensive care. And so we did a lot of training around that. We have intensive care nurses and doctors, but it was that we clearly saw that we would have to augment that team with non-intensive care nurses and doctors, which is pretty scary for that particular cohort of individuals coming into that area. But through the training, then they felt so much better about then joining that team, and since have really enjoyed actually being part of it. So I would agree, actually. I think it is about that team cohesion, having the ability to work in teams is really important, and having the repetition of building up those skills, but seeing the strengths and weaknesses and then being able to work on those is critical. And you can do that when you've got loads of time to be able to do it, as we did on pre-deployment for Afghan. But when you haven't, and when you're in the midst of it, as we are with COVID too.
I'm getting a picture in my head as you describe it, Andrea, of this idea of the plane is in the air, but we have to fix it while we're flying. We can't wait to be educated, because we've got to educate ourselves on the job.
That's a phrase we use a lot in the army, is that you build the bridge as you're crossing it. But it's interesting when you hear Andrea talking, of course, is that one of the reasons our people in the army are so well trained, and they are so well trained, is we do have the privilege of being able to take people out of their jobs, often for a very long time, 3-4 months, even up to a year, to put them through very intensive, very job-specific training. And I think you then see the benefit of that when they go on to do extraordinary things, which they do on almost a daily basis.
And how do you preempt? So I'm going to use an example, because I know this is something you have to consider, Simon, in your role right now. How do you preempt something, prepare for something you know is going to happen?
Yeah. So
at the end of the transition period of Brexit, there are some things that need to be managed with your team, without doubt. But that's at the end of the year, maybe even longer. How do you preempt, prepare for something big that's coming our way?
Yeah, it's interesting, because reflecting on that kind of thing is that the one thing, when we first discussed maybe doing this, when I sit back and I think, every single really challenging event I've ever faced in my career, it's been the first time I've ever come across it. I don't think I was really racking my brain to try and think of an example of something where I dealt with the same issue twice, and I just couldn't. And I think that the way we do it is because you don't really ever stumble into those circumstances, Mark, because you've always got a plan, really. And you mentioned contingency planning, plans, as we'd call it. Yeah, before we go into anything, we constantly are asking that question: what if this happens? What if that happened? What could possibly go wrong? So, do you ever guess what's going to go wrong? No. A couple of times I actually have got it absolutely spot on, but that's the exception, not the rule. But what it enables you is you go in with kind of a mental framework. You're prepared for things to go wrong. So when it does, it's not a crushing disappointment. It's a kind of like, let's just get on with it. And I guess the way we do this, and it probably wouldn't come as much a surprise, is that we in the Army, we like to plan, and we plan relentlessly. And if you look at the organisation I'm very privileged to be part of, 11 Infantry Brigade, we actually configure our whole organisation in cells. One cell's job is to configure the plan, one is to refine the plan, and one is to execute the plan. And they work it in a constant cycle, so that we never go into any situation without it having gone through an awful lot of brains before we do it. And we were talking about training just now. There's a very distinct difference in the military, I think, between training and education. And we do educate our people a lot. And in fact, when it comes down to planning, I would say we teach our people to plan. We don't train them to plan. And we train them to do it in a very ruthlessly analytical way. The big question you drum into them is, so what? When you think of a factor or something, if you ask the question, so what? And the answer is, doesn't matter, get rid. If there is an answer to that, then you bank it and you plan against it. And what we do, and I know Andrea's had the privilege of going through our staff college, so she's been rinsed through this system, is that we do use a number of processes, many of which would be familiar to a civilian audience. We use SWOT. It's good, of course it does. Everybody uses it, but a lot of our processes they're all understood by all. Everybody's trained in the same process. Everybody is practiced in the same process. You run people through it so that if they've got a lot of time, they can take a lot of time doing it. But also they get to a point where it's so instinctive, you can do it really, really quickly as well. We underpin it with a shared language, which is often impenetrable to the civilian audience, but it's even down often to the point that specific words have absolute definitive meanings. So if you get that word, you absolutely understand what it means. Yeah. And if you look at the main process we use, it's a thing called the 7 questions. And what it is about is you get the situation you're about to go into, and you just ask 7 questions about it. The first one of which is, what have I been asked to do and why? And then what has the enemy been asked to do and why? And from that, you go through a process which is about looking at it and just questioning. And really, that's how we deal with the unexpected. You just try to second guess it.
Thank you, Simon. Andrea, I'm going to come to you now, because one of the things that struck me as I listened to Simon is the incredible calmness in a crisis that I understood Simon to say, but also I've had the privilege of seeing that in hospitals. So in my role working as an external consultant for a number of medical suppliers to hospitals, I'm in hospitals regularly. And I was ironically in one of your hospitals, St. Peter's, just before the lockdown. And I'm in a surgery with a vascular surgeon, Neil Browning, a shout out to Neil.
Oh, yes.
And it was a very tricky operation, actually. And there were plenty of times when I thought, my goodness me, I would be losing my control. And that was one of the things that's extraordinary in surgery. There's a calmness in crisis. So I'd love you to help us understand, how does that environment get created in your...
So I think it's a really good question, actually. And I think, again, to come back to that whole team cohesion and team working, you can't, again, underestimate that. And I think that certainly in a theatre perspective, in the operating theatres, they tend to work very closely in close-knit teams, and so they know each other very, very well. And again, it comes back to that sort of having trust in each other, and again, that repetition of going through the same sort of procedures time and time again until you finesse it till it's absolutely, spot on and to a high high standards. So I think there is a bit definitely about that. There's also a bit about the leadership, I think, and Simon's touched upon that, is that I think, you know, for me, coming from the military anyway, leadership is absolutely pivotal in all that we do. And since coming into the NHS, I've from day one of stepping into the NHS, my leadership skills were literally deployed and have been ever since. All of those skills that I was very fortunate to learn and to harness in the military are just coming to the fore. And have done every day really since being in the NHS. So I'm very thankful really for having that that military training, which Simon says we're very fortunate they can take you out for, and I've done that year-long course, that leadership course, which was just incredible. You know, to have that sort of time invested into you, but it pays dividends for the roles that the senior leadership roles you go and do. And as I said, in the NHS, it's as I said, it's really come to the fore. But coming back to that whole piece around the teams, I think, you know, I've seen some amazing stuff that's been happening here, clearly and latterly in the last few weeks, of what teams have had to step up to, what they've had to go the extra mile. But I think a bit about it's about having that flexibility, or building in flexibility as well, because again with the military we go over stuff a lot and plan a lot and then execute those plans, and as Simon says, normally the plans go very well, but we do need to build in some flexibility in that for when things can go wrong. And I think from an NHS perspective, actually they work under enormous pressure, but they do have that flexibility built in to deal with that unexpected event. So I suppose an example I would use is that as we were going into this COVID situation, we were all going through our processes quite neatly as to actions on with where you know positive COVID patients were going to go, which wards were they going to go, which wards were suspected COVID patients were going to go. So that's all about looking at the flow through the hospital and having certain areas designated for COVID, which staff then were going to look after these particular patients, then the personal protective equipment obviously that they would have to wear depending on the type of patients they were looking after. So there's different, as you know from seeing it on the news, different degrees of personal protection that the staff were wearing, some of it quite intense actually, and quite, you know, difficult to wear for long periods of time. Intensive care is one of those areas that you will have seen that. But they you know, we've worn PPE for, you know, it's not nothing new, but actually I suppose as the COVID situation was unfolding, there was definitely, and I didn't expect this, I have to say, is anxiety creeping in to the teams about, is this PPE safe actually? Am I totally protected whilst caring for these patients? And so that sort of doubt came in, which then really did start to affect that team cohesion, and there was doubt starting to come in, and we were starting to hear noise about that, and obviously then there was concerns about, golly, well, we don't want the team cohesion to start falling apart because that's going to obviously impact on patient care. And so as a leadership team, we really had to quickly step in to deal with that situation, to calm the waters, and to reiterate obviously the national message, no, this PPE is right, it is fit for purpose, it is going to protect you, don't worry, just make sure you're wearing it right, and going through those drills again. So that was that was an interesting development. I have to say everything's really calmed down now, and people feel very, very comfortable with what they're doing, but it was an unexpected piece that I didn't expect, I say, to happen. That was a bit of a curveball that came in.
I just want to grab this chance to say a thank you to you, both of you, as emergency leaders. I hear the terminology emergency workers. I get leadership throughout the NHS, throughout the military, in terms of all of the support and excellence, frankly. So it's a chance for me on behalf of everyone who's listening and watching to say a massive thank you for that leadership at a time we need it more than ever. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Tell me more, and that's both of you in this sense. Let's go into this point about you're now in, as we are in the NHS now, a crisis situation to manage. And how is leadership different then? So, Andrea, you managed at Camp Bastion, which in my understanding as a layman is, Helmand Province is an incredibly dangerous area.
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan is itself destabilized constantly, and you're in charge of a huge amount of people. I think it's the biggest camp, army camp overseas that's ever been built, and you're in charge of it. So you're making decisions in crisis. Help me understand how that's different as a leader.
So I suppose, I mean, golly, that facility was when it was obviously fully operational, was the busiest trauma hospital in the world. Actually, the amount of trauma that we were seeing, so that was really quite significant and clearly a leadership challenge. And before going through my pre-deployment, I had various conversations with my commanders, going, Andrea, you've got a big you're stepping into big shoes here, taking over that particular facility, because the survival rate was incredible with the type of trauma they were seeing. It was 98% of individuals who went into that facility, 98% of them would survive. It was absolutely incredible. When you're looking at the trauma from the IED blast of limbs being blown off, and then during our tour, it wasn't just that of limbs being blown off, but also gunshot wounds as well that guys were sustaining. It's pretty nasty actually. But to maintain that survival rate, I mean, golly, that was huge pressure for me, because I didn't want to let anybody down. Obviously, I didn't want to let the guys down, the troops down, and that was not just me, but the whole team as well. So that was why it was so pivotal about that training being so important. So that first day when we step out and we're operating in that facility for the first time, it was seamless. It was like the old team had gone, but the new team were in. And so I suppose that bit of operating as a leader in that particular situation, it again comes back to that training and how it's important, but it's about setting the expectations. And so people being absolutely clear as to what your expectations are, what you will tolerate, what you won't tolerate, and you know what, we've just got to do the best we possibly can here. And I know we will do the best we possibly can, because we're having fabulous training to do it. And the guys did, actually. I have to say, it was an absolute miracles happened in that facility. There's no two ways about it, but it was an absolute dream to see the teams working together. And from a leader, from my perspective, and also my medical director was another key individual within the facility leadership role. I just, for me, it was just getting about and walking about and managing by walking about and being visible. And so when we did have the major incidents of lots of trauma coming in, which was an unexpected, I suppose, although we had trained for it. But still, when you're faced with it, it's still a shock. That the guys just absolutely. The first time was a case of, okay, we can do this, but after that, it was like clockwork, incredible. But you can't underestimate being, as again back to that point about how visible you should be as a leader, and having those conversations with individuals when they're in the moment, and maybe and again the same here through the COVID situation. I've been out on the wards and speaking to staff all dressed in the full PPE, but those conversations mean so much, and they can talk to you about their anxiety that they've got or the next step that they need to take. But I suppose if you actually be having that calming influence and calming the waters, so therefore actually people then sort of, okay, I've got to spring them a step here, I can go on and I can, face the next day, which is what we're having to see here, is people going home and having to deal with, what they've had to deal with in the day, speak to the family, bless them, and then get up and come in the next day to do it all again. That's difficult, but it comes back to leaders and how we're trained, and I'll come back to my military training. I'm so fortunate to have had that military grounding for what I'm doing now. It's come to the fore.
Thank you, Simon. Build on that. There'll be many things triggering for you from what Andrea.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that you should understand is I'm an infantryman, so tip of the spear, and my ability to sell any plan to somebody was absolutely underwritten by people like Andrea. Is that, if people went into kind of dangerous situations, that knowledge that they had a 98% chance of survival if it all went wrong is so important. British soldiers will do absolutely amazing things, but they do kind of expect the system to look after them. I mean, a lot of what Andrew was saying about visibility, particularly I've always thought, in a crisis, you should never ask somebody to do something you're not prepared to do yourself, and you should be seen to do it. But you've got to balance that against the fact that what is your role. But I think the key skill for me, Mark, has always been that we talked about the planning process that we have. The key product of that, in my opinion, is what we call the commander's intent, my intent. And that is the statement that comes out in the orders that allows me to make it absolutely crystal clear to the organisation that this is what we want to achieve. No, this is what we're going to achieve. And make sure that absolutely everybody understands that, because we run a thing in the British Army called Mission Command. And Andrea used the word trust. The first principle of Mission Command, if you look it up in the manual, is trust. Because for it to work, everybody's got to trust each other. Everybody's got to know everybody's up to the task. Because what Mission Command is about is, I'm going to tell you what to do, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I might constrain you, but I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. I'm going to give you the resources. I'm going to empower you, and I'm going to be there to help you. But you just crack on, Lofty, because you know what we're going to do. Because the biggest cliche in the military world is that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You know, I can come up with the best plan ever, and the minute the lead starts flying, it will go wrong. So if everybody understands the intent, they know what is going to be achieved. They've all been trained. They can then all come up with their individual plans in a flash, and before you know it, you have an organization that in effect self-heals, that outguesses the enemy, and you can just sit back and just go, look at the monster I've created, and be enormously proud of that. But exactly as Andrea is saying, that kind of level of trust, the ability for people to work together, is what we do when we're not at war. You know, we train because, you know, they say about war, it's 99% boredom and 1% terror. I'd say that's your military career. It's 99% training and 1% actually doing the job. So, you know, it is really, really about, you know, getting the best people in the right place with the right idea, with the right training, and just letting them cut loose.
Thank you. I tell you what struck me again, it's back into the hospital situation, in surgery, in theatre. And one of the things I find totally extraordinary, I'm totally humbled when your clinician is managing a situation and at the same time they're managing the heart team or the vascular team. And at the same time, they're educating a less senior person. So in the last time I was in St. Peter's, I think your radiologist, Alex Chapman,
oh yes, yeah,
was doing a great job, because as I said, it was a difficult situation and we had to get absolute clarity of decision making. But there was a junior radiologist there who is getting trained as the patient is being managed. So it's a simultaneous multitasking,
yeah,
and staying calm.
Yeah.
And that comes back to education again, doesn't it? And training.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Alex in particular, yeah, he's very good, I have to say. He's very calm, cool, calm and collected guy, actually. But you do highlight a really good point about sort of having to deal with complexity, actually, and competing, you know, demands, isn't it? And being able to do that in a streamlined way that nobody feels like you're not really that interested, or you know you're not got your full attention. And that's a real art, actually, I have to say. But again, you know, I've seen that executed so well in the military, but I have also here in the NHS. It's brilliant to see.
It's interesting you talk about that, Mark, because it was just getting me thinking is that, you know, Andrea will remember this, is that one of the ways we work to make our organizations very robust is everybody is trained to do the job of the person 2 levels above them. So that if that person gets taken out of the fight for whatever reason, they can step up, but then they can step up again. So you're going to have to erode that organization pretty hard before it starts to fail.
And this point about education, it struck me what you said earlier, Simon, about sometimes I teach, sometimes I train, sometimes I tell. So the style of communication differs by situation and individual.
Totally.
And so I'm in St. Peter's with Alex, and he's got this less senior radiologist he's educating. The gentleman I'm with is a clinical specialist from a company called Endologics, who are helping. He's an educator as well. In charge is Neil Browning, who's the chief surgeon, head of the team. There are moments when Craig, who's the external advisor, says, stop there, stop doing that, start doing this. And he's saying that to the boss of that situation, who absolutely goes, great, thanks, needed that.
Yeah.
So there's no hierarchy in that.
Yeah. Never question the person who's on the spot. They know what's happening, you don't. Yeah, that's always been one of the kind of mantras in my command style, is that don't question the person who's actually at the point of it happening, because they know more than you do.
Yeah, yeah. And I think from my perspective, it's about listening, isn't it? And taking on board, what people say to you and stuff. And yeah, you haven't got all the answers. No way.
So a question to both of you now. As we're coming towards the end of this Boostcast, I'd love you to say to people who are nowhere near as regularly in crisis situations as complex and big as you are, and have to make, I think you said it earlier, Simon, quick, smart decisions. What tips do you have for the lay in us that are saying, how can you help me be a sharper decision maker?
Cool. Andrea, do you want to go first?
Blimey, crikey. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
So I suppose from my perspective, it is about keeping calm without a shadow of a doubt. I think it is about understanding the situation that you're in. It's understanding the team that you've got with you, and realizing what their strengths and weaknesses are, but making that as powerful as it possibly can be. And I think it comes back to you're harnessing your leadership ability. And for those individuals who feel they may be lacking in that particular area, I mean, both Simon and I have been very fortunate of going through the sort of military system, who really heavily invest in the leadership aspect for officers, and have made us into the individuals we are today. But actually, there's loads out there for people to be able to do exactly the same thing and harness that leadership ability, I think. And it doesn't really take much, to be honest. I know in the NHS now they've got the NHS Leadership Academy, which they've stood up. And they're trying to do a lot of work with regards to putting that investment in leadership at different levels, like they do in the military. They're sort of emulating that same model, which is great. But all of this can be learned, I think, and I certainly have through my military career. But the big thing for me is about just keeping calm, and certainly whilst I've been in the NHS, those moments where people. Winter pressure is another one that we've had, going through the winter, the big long corridor queues in A&E and all those patients on trolleys, and staff looking at you thinking, oh golly, Andrea, what are we going to do in this situation? This is terrible. And you just got to say, again, that's calmness and being decisive and just saying, well guys, this isn't going to last forever. We will get through this. We've just got to work through it. But this isn't going to last forever. So don't worry, and just do what you do, because you're doing it really well. And I know it's tough, but we will get through that. So that calmness and decisiveness is really important. But really having a good understanding of the situation you're in, I think, is really pivotal.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, I kind of follow on from that last point. Is that an officer who was someone I really looked up to once said to me, "Hope is not a course of action." And if you're in a leadership position, think about the situation you're in, do a bit of an analysis, and try to understand it. Would be the first thing I would always say. Something I've always said to a lot of my subordinates as I've gone up the chain is that, trust your people. They do have a habit of surprising you. It's a cliche, but I'd flick that around, is that trust yourself. You might have a habit of surprise, back yourself. At the end of the day, if you're in a leadership position at any level, be prepared to back yourself, but don't be so dogmatic that if it goes wrong, that you can't go off onto another course of action. And I think, when I went to places like Iraq and used to be quite a senior officer and used to have to talk to quite junior soldiers, and when you're when you're in a battle, I think that fear is often directly proportional to your rank, because the higher up you are, the more you know about what's going on. The lower down is, the more you are there in a situation where you don't really understand, and that's when your fears take over. So make yourself busy. I used to say to a soldier, the worst thing you can do on the battlefield is nothing. So if you find yourself doing nothing, just get up and start shooting at stuff. Just take possession of your own destiny. That's what I would say to people. Have a plan, back yourself, don't go down a path that's obviously going wrong, and take charge of your own destiny.
Thank you. It's Thursday afternoon today, and by coincidence, that's the day when we get the chance as a nation at 8 p.m. to show gratitude for all of the work that emergency leaders are doing right now. I've got two of those leaders in front of me. I just want to say massive thank you again, because the reassurance, just listening to you, and that calmness and that clear thinking under the levels of pressure that you are on regularly, especially at the moment, is hugely reassuring, and I just wanted to say thank you one more time.
Right, thank you. Pleasure.
Yeah. Stay safe.